Anybody know who made this model? Lillian, do you? You've been here for years and years and years, sitting in the church office. Nicely done. The Mayflower. We don't know what the Mayflower looked like. For none of the descriptions of the people coming over could have cared less about the boat itself except to get off it as quickly as possible. We do know that it was 180 tons. But 180 tons can be divided in a whole host of ways, but it seems in all probability that the Mayflower looked something like this. For a marine architect at the Boston Museum of Maritime Studies has drawn up and built a Mayflower known as Mayflower II. The Mayflower itself was an old wine ship. I expect an amen from some people on that. It was a ship that transported wine around the Mediterranean. It was not overly seaworthy and was about due for the graveyard when the Pilgrims themselves hired the ship under Captain Jones to take him to the New World. We don't know how many people were on the ship or what size the crew. Generally, it said there were 102 people on the ship. But of the 102, only 40 were pilgrims, the saints in most of the records. The others were called strangers. The boat itself was not swift. If anything, it was flatter at the back. It had the magnificent cruising speed of 2 miles an hour. From England to this country, and the flatness at the back of the ship, where they had not yet learned that by closing off the flatness, they closed off the pole, because you see a flat ship coming through leaves a wide hole of water behind, and that causes a drag back. So even while they're going forward, the water is pulling them back. Closing that little hole off and flatness off brought a great deal of extra speed to the ship. Pilgrims left at a time when they ought not to have left. For those who know the waters of the Atlantic, recognize that during September and October, these are the time of the hurricanes. Because it was illegal for them to leave the country, and the king's men were watching them. They were watching all of the wharfs, and there were several boats that they could have taken. They had already been swindled once, but their desire to get to this country was so strong that they continued to wait and watch and negotiate. And the owners and the captain of the Mayflower finally agreed to let them set sail. The sheriff's men watched the docks daily until August came, and then they said only a fool would head off into the hurricane weather. And they withdrew their watch until a more propitious time to sail. Being fools for God, the Pilgrims headed out. So, 102 people, plus crew members, set sail. Men, women, and children, living in the cold that was soon to develop below the decks of the ship. For there were concerns about direction and who was in the control and who was in authority. And for long days and long nights, crowded together, they came across to this country. They brought with them some commitments, and one that you'll find interesting is that they had a commitment to education that saved their lives. Harvard University, founded in 1641 by Congregationalists, dedicated to the idea that the ministry should then, so should the laity. That it is education that is the will of God and one of the high callings. Yale University, founded in 1701, was a congregational school founded on the same principles of education, not only of the ministers, but of others. As I indicated to our young people, education was not only for the clergy and the laity, but for the women, long before women's lib. Wesley, Smith, and Vassar were congregational schools for women, highlighting the need for education not only for the Pilgrim fathers, but the Pilgrim mothers. That dedication to education, a dedication that revolved around the fact that every man and woman should be able to read the Bible for themselves, and as a matter of conscience, to speak out and to understand God's will in their lives, saved the Mayflower and the Pilgrims. For you see, in England during that period of time, it was against the law to have a Bible, let alone to read it and study it. We make such an effort here, and we push so hard for people to study the Bible that we can't imagine that at one point in history, including within our own country, the very owning of a Bible was punishable by death. The Pilgrims decided that education opened up God's Word to them, and it saved their lives. I don't think I can draw that out anymore. Do you, David? How did it save their lives? On the voyage over, they were hit by a hurricane. The ship is tiny, it is fragile, though it's very seaworthy in some ways, but one of the main sections of the ship is held together by a beam that goes from this side to this side right there. That beam cracked and began to snap. If that beam had broken, the ship would literally have folded in two and gone down. In that portion of the hold, the Pilgrims, because of their dedication to education, and in spite of the fact that they had little room, had put a printing press. The first printing press in America. It happened to be in that hold, and some enterprising, long before we knew the principles of jacks for changing tires, some enterprising pilgrim, when the beam began to crack and break and fold down, screwed up the printing press until the beam was held solid. And that enabled them to reach this country. Interesting, isn't it? Well, they came. What's the difference between a pilgrim and a Puritan? Anybody? Anybody want to earn $1 this week? I'm going broke with all you sharp people around. What's the difference between a pilgrim and a Puritan? Oh, she's out for $1. Look at that. Okay. Oh, Jack, I'm going to go broke with the two of you. You still haven't told me the difference. A Puritan could be a pilgrim. A pilgrim is one who makes a pilgrimage. Absolutely right. A Puritan is one who wanted to purify, but what's the difference between the two? You haven't earned your $1 yet. Cost you $1 on that answer. Anybody?
Could it be that the Pilgrims were the ones that came here and the Puritans were the ones that stayed behind?
Puritans came in 1625, 5 years after the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. Good try. What? They were neither Pilgrims nor Puritans. They were my forebears, by the way. My family came in the 1600s. I was trying to find the records, and unfortunately the ones that I have don't go back that far, but my family came in the 1600s as part of the settlement of Jamestown. The Carters. Anybody know the famous Carters? Not the peanut farmer, famous variety, but the Carters of Carter Hall Tobacco, the Virginia Carter Halls. If you've ever smoked tobacco or seen a tobacco shop with Carter Hall, those are my grandmother's lineage. And it goes way back. I think they were not here in 1620, but 1626 or something like that. The other side of my family was running wild in England, doing all kinds of nasty things that everybody wants to forget. What's the difference between Pilgrim and Puritan? Well, nobody earned a dollar. You all got portions of it, but you didn't quite get it together. In the Church of England, it was against the law to do certain things. That is, to worship with outside the church. The Church of England, established under Henry VIII when he wanted to separate from the Roman Catholics, was a church which was united with the government. It was a state church. And the fact that it was a state church meant that anything you said about the church or against the church was a statement against the king and therefore treasonous. You're all familiar with Henry VIII and all of his many shenanigans, but you're also probably familiar that during that period of time there were two groups that were forming. One group was, as Jack indicated, the Puritans. They felt that within the church itself, where the church had moved from Roman Catholic to Anglican, there were many things that were not pure. And they needed to purify the church, and they made a stand, and they were made up of people who were part of the church. They were made up of ministers who were part of the church. They were made up of lay people who said that we have an obligation in this church to make it what it ought to be. There was another group who felt that the church could not be purified. And they separated themselves from the church. And if there were a good writing congregationalists who wanted to write one of the most exciting stories and spy adventures and novels of all time, one would write about this particular period. For the meeting of people who believed that you had the freedom under God not only to read the Bible but to interpret it for yourselves and to meet freely, and the whole espionage and counter-espionage as people were trying to find out where they were worshiping and how they were worshiping, the whole torturous routine in which those who were separatists and meeting on their own were taken and thrown into jail, imprisoned and killed and tortured. The whole problem of those who at one time were for turning against and double agents in our modern parlance are all part of this story. And the separatists ultimately were driven out and went to Holland. And there they found freedom of worship, but they were beginning to become concerned because they were English. And the children were growing up speaking Dutch and forgetting their English heritage. And so they went back to England and then ultimately from there made the trip. So the separatists were the Pilgrims. They separated from the Church of England. They separated actually from England and made the original voyage, arriving here in 1620. The Puritans, who continued to live the whole time in England, left under great pressure and came in 1625. They then got together on a very practical matter. We don't understand the ravages of scurvy today, but on the ships coming over, with the lack of fresh vegetables and the fresh fruit, scurvy became a very real problem and weakened the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So much so that in 1620, when the Pilgrims arrived, out of the 102 or thereabouts people who were here, more than half of them died that first winter. Among the Puritans and the Pilgrims, one man was a doctor and skilled in dealing with scurvy. And because it was both an English colony, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and they had one doctor that they shared, they began to work together on that very practical basis, and out of that working came the Congregational Church. When you look at the history, and this is what I really want us to reflect on as we gather about the Lord's table, and we gather a little bit to talk about what's happening in this country. When you look at the history and the concept of freedom, You think of Salem and the Salem witch trials, and it's funny that we always remember the Salem witch trials and the things that went on there that were less than best, and we don't stop and think about the tremendous number of things that the Pilgrims gave to us that are such a part of our heritage that without them we would be eternally different. Freedom. Not only the freedom of worship, but the freedom of conscience. If any of you watched John Kelly last night, where there was a debate going on between a priest and a female woman theologian in the Catholic Church, one of the things that this conservative priest kept saying over and over again is that if people have freedom of conscience, they have become Protestants. Isn't that right? A papist at my back. Formerly. It's true. If you have freedom of conscience, if every man has a right, I'm almost literally quoting him, if every man has a right to think for himself, that's Protestantism. If every man has the right to read the Bible for himself, that's Protestantism, although it's becoming more and more Catholic now. If every man has a right for self-determination, that's Protestantism. And if those things all ring true as what my rights are, that's why you're Protestant at this point. And that's why in our political system, there's a ballot. In 1625, the Salem Covenant was signed and approved. But the discussion that went into it was done by secret written ballot. The first time in America that was done. On the ship coming over on the Mayflower, 102 people, 40 of them pilgrims, the others, quote, strangers, had to make a number of decisions about the ship. They voted. And the pilgrims who were paying for and had, in a sense, control of the ship, opened the vote to all, with recognition that the decisions being made affected all. That's pretty powerful. So with education, with freedom, with the power of the ballot, with the responsibility, with democracy in its best and truest sense, with the concern for the welfare of the community, our Pilgrim fathers and mothers and children brought a heritage to this country that they had found elsewhere, but purified and developed. There also was one other thing as we gather. Who were those 60-odd, 60-some I should say, so the odd isn't misunderstood, strangers? They were crewmen. They were individuals who wanted to get to the new land. They were individuals who were indentured servants and slaves who wanted to earn their way. And deep in the Pilgrim heritage is the idea that whatever a man or a woman has been, whatever their past experiences have been, whatever and wherever they have come from, one can make that pilgrimage to a new land and a new beginning. And if I think of anything as being one of the great foundations of this country, as people have come from all over the world and as people within this country have struggled with themselves, I think that's one of the greatest things that can be said. That regardless of who or where you have come from, it is not a matter of birth, it is not a matter of family, it is not a matter of long history, it is not a matter of hierarchy, it is not a matter of anything except who you become under God. And so as we sing, we indeed do gather together to ask the Lord's blessing.